The legacy media presents warfare as a kinetic spectacle. Missiles, explosions, territory taken. This is a strategic misdirection. The cost of a single Tomahawk missile is $2 million. The adversary's blueprint for victory has evolved beyond this crude, expensive calculus. The primary vector for collapse is no longer loud, it is silent. Global commerce, finance, and data flow through a network of undersea fiber optic cables. According to analysts at RUSI, these are the true arteries of the Western world. They are fragile, largely unguarded, and their locations are public knowledge. Severing a handful of these cables in key channels doesn't just slow down the internet, it triggers a systemic liquidity event. A halt in high-frequency trading and international settlements creates a solvency crisis in milliseconds. The second vector is orbital. GPS is not a civilian convenience. It is the metronome of the global supply chain. CSIS reports confirm that state-level actors possess the dazzler laser technology to temporarily or permanently blind critical satellite constellations. Without timing signals from space, container ships go adrift. Port logistics freeze. The flow of physical goods stops. This is not a missile attack. It is a full-spectrum economic siege executed with plausible deniability. This protocol creates the blind Leviathan, a nation-state with immense kinetic power, but its central nervous system has been severed. It cannot see its assets, track its currency, or manage its supply chains. This induced paralysis is designed to accelerate an internal solvency crisis, triggering mass defaults long before the first shot is fired. The target is not a military base, it is the financial stability of the domestic population. The motive for weaponizing economic stability is not strength, it is a function of weakness. A nation facing a domestic solvency crisis, a mathematical inability to meet its internal obligations, views kinetic warfare as an unacceptable liability. The cost of a conventional symmetric war is a luxury it can no longer afford. Consider the Russian Federation. RUSI analysis frames the conflict in Ukraine not as a simple land grab, but as a forced maneuver to service a domestic liability. The operational cost and political unpopularity of the war created a fiscal black hole, a solvency crisis. The state's survival protocol was triggered. When the kinetic cost exceeds the balance sheet, a state is forced to pivot. The blueprint shifts from symmetric attrition to asymmetric economic attack. This is a launch-on-warning protocol for a failing state. The objective changes from capturing territory to exporting insolvency. The primary vector for this attack is the target's own domestic fragility. An adversary does not need to level a city if it can trigger mass insolvency within it. Reports on the affordable housing crisis, even at a local level like San Diego, are not news. They are battlefield intelligence mapping out pre-calculated vulnerabilities. This protocol is universal. Analysis from Al Jazeera confirms that even the threat of kinetic action from the U.S. forces structural economic instability within Iran, forcing it to delegate import powers. Economic pressure is the precursor to a strategic pivot, creating a feedback loop where internal weakness forces desperate external action. This economic warfare is amplified by a psychological accelerant. Media headlines comparing domestic U.S. crises to conditions in a Russian prison serve a specific function. They erode national confidence and validate the perception of internal decay, making the population more susceptible to the paralysis of economic shock. This isn't a mistake, it is a feature of the attack. The motive is, therefore, survival. A nation drowning in domestic liabilities will always seek to export that crisis to a competitor. It is a zero-sum calculation. The blueprint is to weaponize your weakness against your enemies, transforming a local solvency crisis into the primary vector for global conflict. The math doesn't lie. The kinetic cost of warfare has undergone a solvency crisis. A report from analysts at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, places the cost of a modern main battle tank at approximately $5 million. The cost of the FPV drone that can now reliably achieve its destruction is $500. This is not a simple tactical shift. It is a mathematical certainty that invalidates decades of military doctrine. This protocol is known as the democratization of violence. The barrier to entry for projecting lethal, state-level force has collapsed. It no longer requires a treasury. It requires a credit card. An adversary can now achieve asymmetric leverage, liquidating a competitor's multi-trillion-dollar kinetic assets for a rounding error in their own budget. The math does not lie. This economic model of lethality is the blueprint. An adversary understands it is cheaper to trigger a solvency crisis inside your borders than to confront your military outside of them. Why spend billions on aircraft carriers when they can leverage oil prices or weaponize supply chains to detonate your mortgage market? The goal is to create a domestic liability so severe it forces a kinetic response. This creates a launch-on-warning posture, but for economic collapse. A nation that cannot house its citizens has a pre-calculated vulnerability. Internal economic failure, intentionally triggered by an external actor, makes desperate military action a mathematical certainty for political survival. The adversary's objective is to make war the target's only logical move. The primary battle space is not geographic, it is financial. CSIS analysts identify these gray zones not as nations, but as sectors. They are proxy laboratories for testing economic payload delivery. An adversary monitors the effects of regional instability on a competitor's domestic systems to calibrate the precise dosage of economic shock required for systemic collapse. Consider the Middle East crisis. While legacy media, per Travel and Tour World, frames fluctuating oil prices as a market event, this is a fundamental misreading of the signal. To a state actor, this volatility is a calibration test. Each price spike is a measured probe, assessing the pain tolerance of a competitor's economy and the political cost of a full-spectrum supply chain attack. Adversaries study existing protocols. They reverse engineer the economic pressure tactics used against states like Iran, which Al Jazeera reports is forced to delegate import powers under threat. This is a live-fire demonstration of economic warfare. The objective is not to match carrier groups, it is to trigger a systemic solvency crisis within the target population, bypassing kinetic confrontation entirely. The weapon's impact is domestic. An affordable housing crisis, like the one in San Diego, is not a standalone policy failure. It is a symptom of a successful economic attack. When a public figure like Brittany Griner compares a U.S. crisis to her time in a Russian prison, it provides an adversary with irrefutable proof of psychological impact. This data confirms the blueprint is working. Local insolvency is the primary vector for triggering a desperate, launch-on-warning response. The math is a certainty. The doctrine is known as launch-on-warning. It is a pre-calculated protocol designed to eliminate hesitation. Once an inbound kinetic strike is detected, retaliation is not a debate. It is an automated response. The critical liability is the word detected. Analysts at CSIS identify the fog of digital war as the primary accelerant for systemic escalation. An adversary's cyber attack does not need to destroy the missile. It only needs to blind the radar. If the command system cannot distinguish between a data glitch and a decapitation strike, the commander is forced into a zero-sum choice. Launch and trigger global asset liquidation based on potentially false data, hesitate, and risk absorbing a real first strike, rendering the nation militarily and economically insolvent. As confirmed in reports from RUSI, this is the blueprint. Exploit the decision-making protocol. The fear of being blinded becomes the weapon itself, forcing a solvency crisis at the highest possible level. The initial strike in a 21st century conflict is not kinetic. It is a calibration shot. The objective is not destruction, but data. An adversary must measure a target's systemic fragility, its political response time, the brittleness of its infrastructure, and the exact pressure point where domestic liabilities cascade into national insolvency. This is a mathematical protocol. The blueprint leverages pre-existing conditions. Geopolitical accelerants, such as a manufactured Middle East crisis designed to spike oil prices, source number 2, are timed to amplify internal economic failures. Reports from regions like San Diego already confirm a systemic, affordable housing crisis, source number 1. This is not a local policy failure. It is a documented, exploitable liability. A population teetering on the edge of insolvency is the primary vector for attack. CSIS analysts assess that the logical calibration shot will not target the power grid directly. The attribution risk is too high. Instead, expect a targeted logistical blackout within the next 12 months. This will manifest as a catastrophic, attribution impossible data systems failure at a primary West Coast container port, disguised as a novel ransomware attack. The goal is not to stop ships, but to sever the flow of data that underpins their cargo's liquidity. This is a test to measure the precise number of days of supply chain paralysis required to trigger a cascade of insolvencies across the domestic economy. It is the final data point needed before executing a full-spectrum economic assault.